All right, so we should be live. So let me close this down, and Mr. Davis, you should be okay to call the meeting to order.
Yep. Good evening, everyone. Calling the meeting for July 19th of the Policy Committee to order at 5:35 p.m. I'd like to take a moment to welcome a new member, Donna Schuster, to the committee, and we hopefully will have another new member coming shortly if she's able to get on. Our first order of business is approval of the Policy Committee meeting minutes from June 6th, 2022. Are there any, we have a motion to accept the minutes?
I'll make the motion to accept the minutes. I wasn't here, so.
Right, well, you can make the motion.
Okay.
Is there any further discussion? All those in favor of accepting the minutes, do we need to?
So we have to actually do a roll call when we're doing a live meeting. So
Right.
if Ms. Perro could please call the roll.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Ms. Schuster,
Do I abstain or do I vote since I wasn't here? Question.
You could abstain since you were not here.
Okay, I'll abstain.
Dr. Turner,
I'll have to abstain too.
Okay. Next thing, we move on to public comment. Did we receive any requests for public comment?
no, we did not.
Okay, thank you. Being that there were no requests for public comment, we will move on to number 4, discussion and possible action on policy 5144.1, restraint and seclusion, which is found on page 4 of our packet. Dr.
Sorry
Byers,
to keep disappearing, but I can't see on the phone without going away from Zoom.
okay,
Okay.
all right. Dr. Byers, this, I believe, is started, we discussed this in March at the Board of Ed meeting, I think, and as a first read. I know I sent request suggesting to change the name of the policy, and I saw you included that as a possible recommendation for us. But other than that, I don't think we received any other suggestions. If we did, I don't know about them, but maybe you would fill us in on what's going on with this.
Yes, so we did not receive any other suggestions. And as we've noted a couple of times as we've reviewed this policy, a lot of this language is governed by state statutes. I won't go into the details of why, but it's very formalized language. The one thing that Mr. Davis, you did request was the change in the title so that it clearly is referencing sort of the 3 things that are the components of this policy: the physical restraints, inclusion, and the exclusionary timeout. It was last updated in 2015. And I think because it's a policy that deals with what is could be a fairly controversial subject that is very much tied to statute, it has been reviewed by the board's attorney. Other than that, I think the title change is perfectly appropriate. Content of the policy, I had asked if people wanted to change the content, that they send it to me ahead of time so that I could check with the board's attorney, but we didn't actually change any content in the policy.
All right, is there any other comments, questions from board members? Seeing that there are none, I think we need to have a motion on this for a second read to forward to the board with a recommendation for approval.
I'll make the motion.
I'll second.
All right. Pam, can you?
Okay, Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Ms. Schuster,
Yes.
Dr. Turner,
Yes.
All right. Uh, That will be forwarded to the board recommendation for approval as a second read. And we move on to number 5, discussion and possible action on 4148, employee protection, which is page 11 of our packet. Once again, this is another policy that we reviewed in March, and I know in our previous review, there were some discussions which some of the members had a concern, and I related my concern to Dr. Byers, and I would go from the point of letting her explain what the policy is and how she feels about it in her recommendation.
So just as kind of a recap, we were in the midst of reviewing the 4000 series, right, which pertains to personnel when we hit this policy. And there was a concern that this policy was somewhat generalized and there wasn't protection for the students, which is how we ended up simultaneously reviewing 5144.1, because these two policies dovetail together. What we did do was, this is an existing policy of the board, so we could just leave it as is. But what we did do was look at some CABE language as well as language that came from some of the sample policies that they sent us as part of our revision to kind of, I would say, sort of tighten down this policy. And it really affords protection for employees when they have to make a decision to put a student into a physical restraint, a seclusion, or an exclusionary timeout. I think that the recommendation by and so there have been language changes. If you look back from March until now, you will see that there are language changes that the policy committee has approved over time. The final language change was recommended or suggested by Mr. Davis, which was the removal of that second sentence, which you should see as struck out on the clean copy. Because, and Mr. Davis, you might be able to explain this better, but the thought was the idea of kind of being able to, in an instant, make a decision about minimizing injury to anyone is kind of a high task to ask somebody when you're in the midst of a crisis where you actually have to employ some manner of physical restraint, seclusion, or timeout to a student. So again, it's really the two of these pair together. There are a huge number of protections for students when they go into physical restraint, seclusion, or exclusionary timeout, and a very, very specific process that we as board members and staff have to follow. This, again, sort of parallels that to give some kind of protection to employees when they have to make that decision. It's few and far between, but the two of them pair well together.
Any other comments from members of the committee?
I
Anna?
have concern about protecting Amity property, that it doesn't dovetail or support the policy 5144-1 or .1, because this, I could see that it making more sense to say an employee may use reasonable physical force to restrain a minor or to remove a minor to another area, only to prevent serious physical injury to themselves or to another person, but not to protect school property.
So I seem to remember, and maybe Mr. Davis and Dr. Turner, you can talk about this. We did talk about that in earlier discussions of revisions. There are occasions when the behavior of a student might result in significant property damage. And there are situations that warrant us trying to protect the interests of the district when they're damaging something that is of such high value.
Yeah, I think, Donna, that many of us shared your concern about saying property destruction is a reason to use physical force, but that the language that's in there talking about the need to employ de-escalation and attempting to use voice and interpose other things before a physical force thing, like it seemed to me clear that the goal is not to have physical force as the go-to for all events, but to have a protection for an employee who makes a decision that this needs to happen in the moment, to know that they're not going to get like automatically fired for doing it.
And again,
And
the amount of training that staff have to go through in order to employ any one of those items referenced in 5144.1 is pretty significant. It's a significant contribution of time, and it has to be annual. So it's not something, and again, these are all statutorily connected. It's not something that's employed lightly, but there certainly can be situations where we don't want a student damaging property. So, I mean, and I'll give you an example from my teacher role. I would not want a student going into my chemistry cabinets and just indiscriminately dumping chemicals onto the floor because they're angry about something. I would actually physically restrain them at that point in time. And that's property, but I'm restraining them because of property damage. It's not like we're restraining a kid because they decide to smack, a toilet paper dispenser off of the wall. And again, it's all about the hierarchy of training that we identify in 5144, but it does protect the staff when you have to make a decision about doing something that we really don't want to do ever.
Right. Well, in that instance, I can see that in a chemistry lab, if someone is dumping chemicals or doing something, they're actually might cause harm to themselves or to others.
Right.
yes,
But in that instance, you would use it, but not to protect property.
But again, that's
Well, but
kind
that
of the
is-
litmus. The litmus test is around doing harm to themselves or others. But it may not be an actual direct physical threat to themselves or others. It may be through the property that we have.
Right. But this is how this is reading it. It actually is to protect the property.
Well, so again, and I don't like telling war stories, but I've had kids take baseball bats to the school, not in Amity, but in elementary schools. And at a certain point, you restrain a student who's taking a baseball bat to the windows of a school building.
So I guess my next question is, I couldn't find a CABE policy that mirrored this. And have we gotten any type of, has the board gotten any type of legal opinion, a written legal opinion about the use? I know statutorily you can use it for property. I know I see that. And how often does this actually happen that we have to use physical force?
I say not very often. The last time we reviewed this policy was the first time we had to use physical force to restrain a student in like 6 years. So I would rather not jinx myself. So CABE reviewed every single one of our policies and every single one of our series. The reason why 4148 came forward was because CABE reviewed it and said it was acceptable as the original policy is written. But as we looked at it, there were things that we as a policy committee wanted to make adjustments to, which I think we have. But we could certainly, again, keep our existing 4148 because CABE approves it and says that that is appropriate as written. We have not, I don't think we reviewed 5144.1. But I use the CABE model policy services that we have access to make updates to that one. And the biggest updates that we made were around the exclusionary timeout because that's the statutory language that's been added since 2015.
Okay. No, I understand. And I just, because, physical force, even through the U.S. Department of Education and restraint, has led to, unfortunately, deaths of students, that the liability that Amity takes on if the sole discretion is from a teacher and something unfortunate happens, and the sole reason is not to protect a student or to prevent serious physical injury to themselves or another person, but to simply like protect a whiteboard. I don't know if that.
But again, that's not the purpose, and the level of training that our staff receive would not be to protect a whiteboard. And I don't know what else to say. They have to go through this annual training every single year. It's with a group that is certified by the state to provide us with that training. And there is a series of de-escalation techniques that staff have to learn before they even go to sort of these more extreme measures. But at the same time, and again, I'm going to advocate for my teachers, I don't want to take away the protection that they have to make decisions in a very, again, this is not a mild situation when we employ these things. These are crisis situations when we might have to make these types of decisions. And I think we do a disservice to our teaching staff, our paraeducators, our security guards, when we don't say we're going to protect them, when they truly believe they're making a decision at that point after training to put essentially what we would say hands on students.
All right, before we go any further here, I too have expressed some concerns about the position that some members of the staff might be put in having to possibly restrain a student to prevent them from damaging property. I understand your explanation, and I understand Ms. Schuster's concern. I think we all have that position. Other than that, is there any other specific concern that this policy we need to look at before we move on? Other than that line in there, does everything else look like it's acceptable to us?
To me, yes.
Okay. My suggestion is that we take a motion to approve this policy as it's been presented and vote on that. Should the vote go against it, we'll have to come up with a revision. Should the vote go forward in favor of it, any member of the committee is welcome to present to the board. We're only making a recommendation, a minority opinion as to what your concerns are, and then the board would be in a position to vote, make a decision on it at that time. Is that agreeable to everyone?
Yes,
Yes.
it's agreed.
Okay, we have a motion. We have a motion to approve this policy.
So moved.
Okay. I don't think we need a second. So the motion is to recommend, this will be a second read, recommend to the board passage of this policy as it's been presented. Now we'll take a vote on that.
Mr. Davis,
Yes.
Ms. Schuster,
No,
Dr. Turner,
Yes.
Okay, so the motion as made is passed, and when we have this come up at the board meeting for an agenda item, we'll be able to discuss it and make another decision if necessary at that time. All right, let's move on to number 6. Discussion and possible action on policy 5131, conduct and discipline, which is pretty long. So
Sorry.
that's all right. I know this has to do with statutory change and
yes,
some other things that were necessary. So, and of course, your note that explained some of the things that we see in this. So, Dr. Byers, I'll hand this over to you and see what we can do here with it.
Yeah. So, my recommendation when we left executive session back at our June board meeting was that we kind of skip a chunk of the 5,000s, which are the student policies, and go to the discipline policies, because there's so many questions around those within the community. And so what I did is I started with our policy, which is 5131. And I really used the BOA districts as sort of a litmus test. So I looked at the Bethany School District, the Orange School District, and the Woodbridge School District to see if I could glean any additional information from any of them. Bethany actually has the alternate policy, the 5114. That's their long policy that describes suspension and expulsion, and a very brief 5131. The Woodbridge School District just uses CAVE policies as written, so they just use the 5131. And Orange uses the same attorneys we do, so their 5131 reads the exact same way that ours does. The nice part, Bethany does use a different educational attorney group. So I was able to use some language from them that I know has been reviewed by a board attorney. And so that's where some of the language comes from that is designated in red, or if you're in black and white, it might be a lighter color, that represent the changes. The other thing that I just want the board to know is that these are very much tied to statutory language. So this policy was reviewed by the board's attorney about 2 years ago when the statutory language around expulsion changed. So it's already a fairly updated policy. What I tried to do was add language that would help to clarify some of the questions that we continue to get from community members, particularly parents, around our student discipline policy. As Mr. Davis noted, it is an incredibly long policy. And my original thought was to try to sort of split it out and have the kind of language around expulsion and suspension, which is the denial of educational services, separate from kind of the conduct. But as I looked, so first of all, that has never been our board's attorney's recommendation. And as I looked at the other districts, nobody else does that either. I suspect it's because every time the statute is updated, it would mean tightening it down in 2 places. And from an attorney's perspective, that exposes yourself to more liability. So the attorneys like to have it all in one place. And certainly our board's attorney made that recommendation when we were reviewing the policies to begin with. So as I would emphasize, 5131 is currently our existing conduct and discipline policy. The language that I've added was first in the initial section on areas of responsibility. I added language around support staff because we do have a lot of support staff who work with our students, and their responsibilities were not designated in this policy. And again, the language I borrowed from existing policies, actually from Bethany, because they have a little bit more language in their policy around support staff. And then I added language around students, particularly because I believe by the time we're talking about middle and high school age students, that they exhibit a certain amount of responsibility around the areas of conduct and discipline, and it should not solely rest in the hands of the school staff and the parents. So that was the first big change. The language around, again, just some clarifying language. When we talk about suspension, we often talk about it in 2 ways, either in-school suspension or out-of-school suspension. Some bus suspension is often categorized as out-of-school suspension because the philosophical standpoint from the statutes is that if you deny transportation privileges to a student, they are not able to come to school, and therefore you are effectively suspending them out of school. So those 2 tend to get grouped together. I don't know that that's necessarily the case in a more affluent upper middle class district, but it is a reality that when you deny a child their transportation privileges, they may not actually be able to attend school in person. So those 2 are usually lumped together. The alternate, let's see, I'm moving on to page 15. And under item 2B1, it's not just the use of alcohol, but it also includes the use of drugs as we have defined in our drug policies. I do believe that some of the alternate language, which again, keep in mind, there are two different kind of prominent educational attorney firms. There is ours, the one that we work with, Bertram and Moses. There is Shipman and Goodwin. This is just different language that says the same thing, but in different ways from each of these firms. So I did feel that possibly the alternate language that was presented is a little bit more clear. It's a little more simplified. I think it's easier to understand. But if we included that, we have to do some more definitions at the beginning of the policy. So something for you to consider. If we added the definitions, I have the language around those that I could add. Specifically, the definitions, I believe, are around what is considered to be a weapon.
I far prefer the alternate language on the weapons. I think it's a lot more clear and makes more sense to me.
So what would end up happening is we would use that alternate language, and then up top where it defines what a weapon is, that would go into the definitions. So item 2 in our existing policy would move to the definitions of what is considered a weapon. But I did think the alternate language was much clearer. So that's kind of how we would add to that.
Dr. Byers, before you go any further,
Sure.
you don't have to come back and just keep on looking at this stuff. If all members of the committee agree that that's the language we'd rather have in there, I'd rather see if we can go and take care of that at this point. Is there any objection to substituting the alternate language that Dr. Byers has recommended with the addition of the definition of weapons in the definitions earlier on? If there is no objection, then we would use that as a substitute. Are there any objections to that?
I don't object to changing it on page 15 and 16, though I don't particularly care. It's on page 17.19 that I particularly like the alternate language, also on firearms, page 24, 25. So
Let's do this one at a time.
yeah.
Okay?
I'm sorry. I thought you were trying to do it all at once.
No,
Okay.
haven't gotten there yet. Okay, Donna?
Well, I'm just curious, when we come to conduct and discipline, are we also talking about bullying and cyberbullying and teen violence?
Well, right now we're just working on the language around the conduct off school grounds, with a very specific reference to what we're statutorily mandated to do when a student is found to be in possession of a weapon.
Okay, so for the weapon,
so it's considering the alternate language with the additional definition proposals, just applying to page 15, carrying on to 16.
no, I have no issues.
Okay,
Okay.
that now becomes the language that we're going to use. All right, so.
All right.
All right.
So then we get to section 3, which is really pages 16, 17, 18, and 19. And this is the rather extensive list of things that students could possibly do that would result in disciplinary consequences. Again, I looked at both the list that was provided by CABE in their model policy, which is actually the same as what Bertram and Moses, our attorney firm, does. And then I also added in the language from Shipman and Goodwin. So all of these are attorney reviewed. And where you see the red additions, those were things that essentially Shipman and Goodwin had as part of their language that I felt we were missing. I certainly think number 6 is kind of just an addition. I think number 7 is just to really update it to be more current to what we statutorily identify as minoritized populations at this point in time.
I think on number 7, I would really like to talk about including socioeconomic status in there. I don't think you should be able to harass someone for their class any more than the others. And once you start listing, I feel as though we should try to be complete.
I'm happy to add that. And I'm wondering, I don't know, I don't know if there's a way of kind of putting in a blanket other minoritized groups clause. That one I may check with the attorney on. But, you know, kind of like as the minoritized groups change over time,
Yeah.
I might be able to see if we can have kind of an all-encompassing like other people clause. But let me check on that, but I can certainly add in socioeconomic status.
Maybe we
Okay.
could put a statement there, including these, and then including but not limited to these.
That would also help.
That seems good. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Number 19, I was hoping actually, so yeah, that's like the one that's really specific for bomb threats, which I feel like we could actually keep the bomb threats one, and then we could potentially use the alternate language and make an additional bullet, or we just replace the bomb threats with the alternate language. Obviously, the alternate language is much broader. And yeah, and certainly bomb threats are things that we attend to. So I kind of felt, I was sort of neutral on that. I think in either way, I mean, if a bomb threat's going to come in and we can trace it back to a student, we're going to apply disciplinary consequences. So that's sort of not tremendously critical to me, but we could definitely split them up and include both of those.
I felt like the language about threats just includes bomb threats. It seems to me kind of obviously. I don't see that we gain a lot by making a second bullet point for bomb point threats. But I also, you know, if you want a separate one, I don't care deeply.
And I think that's the policy, the model policy that I pulled that from did not have a specific line item drawn out just for bomb threats and encompass threats altogether. So I'm guessing that the interpretation of the attorneys was the same for that one as you're reading it, Dr. Turner.
Yeah, I would be happy to strike out the bomb threat line just to have it have fewer words, but I can go with whatever.
I'm good with that, Dr. Turner, also. Ms. Schuster?
Well, I don't have any objection either way. I just want to explore how listing provides no room for open interpretation.
All right.
Do you mean you'd prefer saying threats of any sort rather than?
Well, maybe give an example, bomb threats, and just maybe in parens put in types of threats, verbal, physical, bomb threats, and anything that can be traced back to now we have to consider social media, electronic. So when you say electronic, it's inclusive of social media as well, not just email. So I'm not sure if that's beneficial.
So maybe some language similar to what Mr. Davis suggested up and under number 7, including but not limited to.
Right, including but not limited to. I mean, you don't want to get to a point where you have to list every single thing.
Yeah, I feel like threatening in any matter, including orally, in writing, or via electronic communication, that covers it for me.
Social media can certainly fall into the nuance of electronic communication, but at the same time, part of the challenge with policy, right, is that it is a rock, right? It's a solid, and the world around us is like a gas moving really quickly. So the idea is that we always try to write policy in such a way that it's going to be broad enough to anticipate what changes come forward. So including not limited to does give a kind of out if something changes that we are unanticipatory of. to be a little more flexible.
Yep. I was really impressed with all these policies about display of pornographic images. Like when this policy was written originally, I imagine people would have been astonished to think that that was a necessary.
Yeah, so
bullet point.
obviously 25 through 28, those are all new. Those came from the Shipman model and clearly incorporated things that I think weren't really considered when the CABE/Bircham model was developed. I would recommend adding those because certainly those are additions that we see on a regular basis. And I think we've covered those somewhat under both our acceptable use policy and also kind of just our bullying policies. But I think this makes it a little bit more explicit. And then, and we can probably look at all of these together, but then we currently have the number 29 policy, which I think both models still have. It's a statutory language. I told you, even in my notes to you guys, I hate it because I think it just sounds like we're idiots because we talk numbers, but the attorney says that's what the statute says, keep it. But items 30 through 34, I think much more clearly delineate what we capture in one item, which is under 35. Now, to be fair, our acceptable use policy was just recently updated by the attorney. So I do think it's in there. I just don't think it's as clear as it's lined out in items 31 through 34. I really liked the Shipman model for those. And I think that would meet the needs that we have to communicate what we accept and what we don't accept for appropriate behavior.
This may be getting too far down in the weeds, but remember all the trouble with those TikTok challenges?
Yeah.
Is there something here? I'm not quite certain that these policies prohibit the promotion of behavior that would violate these conducts, like inciting people to break the rules.
That's a really good point. I'll work on that. I'll see if I can't come up with a bullet point that's sort of like, I mean, obviously kids who did, break things like that all falls under the vandalism piece. The kids who stuffed the oranges in the toilet, that all falls under the vandalism piece, but encouraging that. Yeah,
I just feel like I'm not clear that in their social media stuff, it's prohibiting trying to get people to do things that are stupid.
I mean, somehow inciting.
Yeah.
Well, I'm curious, or I'm just thinking about when you're talking about code of conduct, and if we want to think about anything that creates, a hostile environment or infringes upon the rights of others, and maybe anything that disrupts the orderly operation of the school.
Well, I guess maybe it falls under those disruptions to educational process. I don't know. That's what occurs to me when I'm trying to think, has everything I've heard of comfortably fit in these bullet points?
Right. So what I'm saying, I'm thinking about a code of conduct and a discipline is an overall statement that you begin with for students. And when you talk about, the whole point is that you want the educational institution to have an environment that, we're physically, emotionally, and intellectually safe. And then we want to have a code of conduct that we understand we don't infringe upon the rights of others or disrupt education and are respectful. And we talk about code of conduct, and then I guess all of these things that lead to disciplinary actions that also include any type of social media that incites a negative action.
So again, I mean,
I'm not sure if it belongs here. I just thought I'd ask.
I mean, number 38 is kind of critical to this whole thing, right? Because we talked about this again during our executive session. We are not capable of anticipating every single poor choice and decision that a student is going to make that disrupts the educational environment or that causes some sort of harm to others. So item 38 is kind of critical for us because it's, again, the catch-all clause that lets us make decisions based on the circumstances and what how a certain behavior might impact the school environment. At the same time, all the other items are things that have either through statutes been identified as inappropriate behaviors or just kind of basic discipline data collection are kind of the categories of inappropriate behaviors. So they sort of delineate a little bit more of what is and is not acceptable. But I think we're always going to have circumstances where the behavior is not anticipated, and yet it still disrupts the educational process, the environment. And so we kind of need that 38. I in some ways, I'm a little leery of the social media piece on two levels. The first is it so frequently happens so far outside of our control and our ability to monitor that I think putting that as an onus on school employees and for us to discipline students starts to cross a line between where school ends and where home and community begins, and where it starts to switch from the school to, say, law enforcement. Now, again, we partner really well together, but that is a little bit of a challenge around the social media. And again, we also have a whole separate policy around bullying and social media's employment or the use of social media for bullying. So that's something different. So we have to kind of keep that one separate because that's a different policy that, again, is a little more statutorily defined and clear. But I do get a little uncomfortable when we start talking about the social media piece because a lot of that is not happening during school, in school. And frankly, my experience is sometimes it crosses school districts in and of themselves. So like you could have a 6th grader bullying a 7th grader, and those are, for us, those are two different school districts. It's not even anything we can really deal with or manage. So that makes me a little bit, I think we're putting a really high burden onto our staff to be able to address things that honestly are happening far outside the realm of our buildings, our students, and in some cases, literally our districts.
What about,
in
what
some
about when
cases, our towns.
I'm sorry, what about when it does happen in the schools?
I think that would be different. And I think that comes back to, I would say, number 34, violation of the district's acceptable use agreement, internet use, because if you were literally in the school at that point in time, employing social media to actively engage in some sort of inappropriate behavior, then you're really violating our acceptable use policy. If you're on our servers, our devices, our internet, then
Recording our students.
yeah, it kind of dovetails into that. So I think that we're protected more through the acceptable use policy for when it happens in the school during the school day, but putting that onus to monitor kids 24/7 in every single environment onto our school staff because of social media, I think is a big ask. And I'm not sure, I be honest, I don't know we could do that.
Do we?
Well, now that we've talked it through, it sounds to me as though the inciting thing isn't necessary because anything that actually affects school is going to fall under the affects the educational process clause. So I think we're good.
So do we need to talk about, not now at this, but more of the acceptable use policy to avoid social media being a part of the school setting?
So our social media policy was updated, I think, last year. So it was a very new update on the social media policy. And the reason why we did that is because we wanted, again, they to partner. We were working on the acceptable use policy for staff, and simultaneous to that, we updated the acceptable use policy for students. Our attorney personally reviewed both of those, made the changes, and those are both up to date. So I feel we're in a good shape with acceptable use on both ends for staff and for students.
How does that touch on? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, and I just may make a recommendation that if there's anybody who has questions about those, maybe they can go back and review those policies. And if there's anything that you feel is inappropriate or doesn't cover the areas that you wish to have covered, then we can bring that up and bring it back to the policy committee rather than discussing whether or not it's there now or if we don't know for sure.
Okay.
So I'd like to keep moving here. I think we've gone over pretty much most of those bullet points up to 39 with 35 eliminated. I am not clear whether or not we decided to change what number was it? The one about the bomb threat, or take that out. Remove number 19 and use the alternate language with the these the non-inclusive ones.
So the recommendation was to use the alternate language, but to put in that language of including but not limited to.
Including but not limited. Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Is everybody okay with that?
Yep.
That was number 19.
Yeah.
And then Dr. Turner, if I understand you correctly, that idea of inciting poor behavior, we don't need to add that language because it still falls under number 38.
Yeah, it sounds to me like it's not going to help you at all to have, and it might make things more difficult.
You know, we also have to keep in mind that the administration has the authority to provide regulations and rules for things that are not spelled out in policy. Basically, they're permitted to make those regulations or make rules or administrative policies that cover things that are not mentioned. And I believe that's under the authority of the superintendent as described in state statute. So things that we missed can be done as needed by the administration.
Yes, and again, you know, I know we've talked a lot about communication of this. Some of the language that I pulled into the policy comes actually from our student handbooks. So a lot of the communication, particularly around this policy, is in the student handbooks that are developed by the schools themselves. The high school has their own, the middle schools work together to develop their student handbook. So a ton of language is, and they're very good. They lift a lot of the language from the policy so that it parallels. But anyway, moving on.
Progressive discipline.
Section 4. So that's the new section. And this was the section that I couldn't find any models for, although I could swear there was a CADE briefing on this at one point. But I used language actually from other school districts, so sort of outside the BOA area, as well as language that we have in our student handbooks that hasn't been part of policy. But it is the concept around the idea of progressive discipline, which I think it addresses what we often hear, which is the zero tolerance concept. So if a student, swears at another, if a student swears at a teacher, they're automatically given 3 detentions, period, done. Doesn't matter how old the kid is, what the circumstance is, whether or not they had special needs, what the counselor knows about that child. It's just that cut and dry zero tolerance. Progressive discipline really talks about the idea that we address it based on a variety of factors for the kid, including their age, because again, how we address a 7th grader might be very different for how we address a 12th grader. Their social development. So there are some students, and I think we probably all have children like this, who mature at different rates compared to others. So we understand there's different levels of maturity for our kids. And certainly some of our special needs students, particularly our students with pragmatic language issues, like students on the autism spectrum disorder, or students who maybe are cognitively disabled, do not have the same level of executive functioning that what we would call a neurotypical student might have. So we have to take all these things into account. We also have to address the nature and severity of it. So something that severely disrupts the educational environment versus something that happens that maybe impacts 1 or 2 students might be treated differently. The number of referrals that a kid has had prior to that, I know as an associate principal, I always looked at that. If a kid had been to me for 17 times for being tardy to class, I might treat them really differently than the kid who was tardy the first time ever in their life, because there are really, there's different circumstances around that. So that idea of looking at the circumstance and the situation is really how we function. I don't know that that has clearly been communicated, because that seems to be one of the sticking points we always have when people feel that we need a 0 tolerance policy for student behavior. I also think it's helpful to have the bulleted list of the possible consequences that students could receive. This is something that I sort of saw in our student handbooks, but again, as a result of our executive session, when people said, we didn't know you could get Saturday school. We didn't know you had a breakfast club. So that's where I pulled some of this language from. It's actually already in the student handbooks. I just kind of melded it into the policy to say that these are the possible outcomes. And obviously, kind of built it in a hierarchical manner. But then at the same time, there's the idea that you do a consequence that's fit for the misconduct. So, if you break something, you fix something, that kind of process. So this section is entirely new. There is really no model for it in our BOA districts. There are models for it in other school districts, and certainly we have some of this language in our handbooks, but it has never been codified into policy.
I was very happy with this section. I thought it helped explain things that a lot of parents and community members have questions about, and the language is clear, and I think it helps explain the purpose and the considerations that go into making these decisions. A tiny thing, I think counseling has 1 L, not 2.
Yeah, it probably does. Thank you.
No, but I strongly support this section.
Okay, can we, any other comments?
I mean, I guess my question to the board members here is, there something that's missing? Because this has been the sticking point, right? With all of the discipline that happens, everybody feels like nothing is done and we don't address things because we're probably using some variant of progressive discipline within this process. So my question is, what is missing from here to be clear to somebody who doesn't live the day in, day out of how we deal with kids, that can explain it to people?
Is there a way to share this with the community? I mean, I apologize for being late. My mom was discharged from the hospital today, so been on the phone a lot. But is there a way to maybe start off the school year and say, in light of some of last year's disciplinary or possible things that happen at the school, here's a reminder, here's a refresher, so that people know about it?
So I think there would be a couple of ways we can manage that. I think the student handbooks are static documents, so we could update those. Although some of this language, like I said, I already stole from the student handbooks, so it's already slightly in there. I also think that we, again, this is a communications committee type of thing, since
Yeah.
all of you are here.
Yeah.
We could, as a communications committee, send out a message to the community that the policy committee updated
Yeah.
the policy, and this is a significant section that was added, and we could push that out and communicate that to our families very clearly. The other thing that I've been working on is there is a list of required policy notifications that every parent has to receive. We've sort of achieved that with our student handbooks, but I'm actually going through that item by item and linking it to policies. So I would link this policy into that. And so parents would have that as a communication as well. I think it's going to be more brief, like, hey, here's the student conduct policy. It outlines everything regarding appropriate behaviors, how we discipline students, in the process for suspension and expulsion. It's a very brief, like, description, but it links directly to the policy, which would reflect the new information. So I think there are a couple of ways we could communicate that. I do think kind of a letter going out from the board through communications committee would be sort of one of the first things we could do, because this would be a significant addition to the policy.
I think one sentence that you could adjust here, Dr. Byers, at the last paragraph, you say parent notification is at the discretion of the administrator addressing the violation. I feel like if you're an upset parent reading that, you might think that this means they don't have to tell you. And you might want to change that sentence to say, parents will be notified in a manner according to the discretion that may include letters or email or, whatever, so that it's clear.
I thought the same exact thing when I read that. That was that one, the only part that just like stuck me for a minute.
So let me talk to my high school admin team, because that came directly from their handbook. It's not in the middle school handbook. It's directly, like, that is the exact language in the high school handbook. And I kind of want to see what they're hoping to achieve with that and see if there's a way we can support each other. So I will work on a revision to that. I totally get where you're coming from, but at the same time, I don't want to create a system that makes it impossible for them to do their job as well. So let me.
Well, I agree. I don't want to dictate the manner of it. I just want to have it clear that parents will, so that people understand they're going to hear what's happening to their kids.
Yep. So let me just check with them and see how I can do a revision.
Okay.
Right. I agree with Jenny that I think that in order for behavior to be reinforced and corrected at home, the parent has to be informed as to what's happening at the school, because not all students are going to share.
I just want to talk a little bit about process. I want us to keep in mind that we are just in the beginning stages of formulating this policy, and we will be recommending that the board examine this policy in a first read. The question I have for the administration and the other members of the committee, do we want to put out a letter at that particular point that the board has been given this policy as a first read? This is what's being proposed, and give the public an opportunity for input on what they think of that, and then have it come back to us, of course, as a second, so we can examine that.
I mean, so we don't even have to move it forward to a first read to the board after tonight. We could just say we need to keep working on it because it's already 6:30. So we could say, yeah, we're good and we don't need to keep doing this. I actually think it's such a hefty policy that it would probably behoove us to carry this over into September, for all of us to leave here tonight, chew on what we did. I can make the changes that we've already recommended and send it back to the committee and say, okay, this is what we've updated. So this is how it reads now. And then maybe at a certain point when we are ready to push it to a first read, at that point, we could send some communication to get feedback.
The chair likes your recommendation.
That's a very good recommendation. I like that.
Excellent recommendation.
Can I ask one question? Are we going to stop right here? Because I was just wondering if we could add, if we're going to go into 5, I just wanted to talk about number 1, but I can wait till next meeting. if-
Why don't we hold off on that?
Okay,
Okay? And because we also have another, and I do have a question that I raised earlier on the last item on the agenda. I believe there was a typographical error on the number of the policy.
Might be.
Pam, you want it?
Yeah, it should be 5144 and I have 5114.
Okay. So we'll table that also, and going forward, we will have 5144 and 4148 going forward as the second read. And we made those motions already. And the rest, conduct and discipline, would be a first read, I think. No, that's this one. Okay, we're good with that.
Yeah, I think conduct and discipline, items 6 and 7, we would kind of table until our next policy meeting.
Yep.
I'll make the changes up through items 4, and we'll pick up at item 5. I'll try to make them in a different color so you can kind of keep track of everything that we're doing.
We like it.
And yeah, and if as you sort of, because like I said, these, as Mr. Davis observed, these are rather lengthy policies. So as you're chewing on them, if there are other questions or thoughts or suggestions, send them to me because I can populate those in. I think our next policy meeting, usually we kind of get back on a regular schedule after the summer. And so we sort of end up like a couple weeks before the prior board meeting. So I'm sure Mr. Davis and I will work out like when, or maybe we already have it. Ms. Perro probably knows when our policy committee meetings are already scheduled. But I think, I think this is worth the time that we spend kind of going through it line by line. I certainly appreciated literally the 2 days. It took me like 2 full days to sit there with multiple windows open of different policies, looking and comparing and saying, okay, this makes sense. And sending it on to my admins, to my principals and saying, please look at this. Does this work for you? Because ultimately, I need it to be something they can execute. So, so far, so good. But yeah, I think it's one worth spending time on.
I do have a listing for the next meeting at August 29th.
I think that sounds right.
Yeah,
That's
we
like
talked
the first
about
day of
that.
school, right? Yeah. Yep.
Okay, very good. Is there any further business? If not, do we have a motion to adjourn? Everybody wants to stay?
Nobody, you guys want to stay?
Okay,
make the motion to adjourn.
okay.
I'll second that.
All those in favor?
I think we can do show of hands. Perfect.
All right, enjoy for the few weeks coming up. The summer seems to be going very fast for all of us, I'm sure.
Yes.
Enjoy.
All right.